first I should say that we had almost identical event yesterday in London. And since this is, one of my habits is not to give a lecture twice. I try to avoid it at any price. But since this is about the book and it is literally predetermined, for those who were in my lecture yesterday, I give my apologies. It is pretty much the same lecture. Or you can leave if you wish. I would like you to stay though. I would like to begin first by outlining the major themes of the book for the benefit of those who have not read it. I will then move to a discussion of how this book fits into a larger project, a move that will itself be conducive to explaining the deeper structures of the present book. But I also will be talking about that larger project, which is the next book. I think the first thing to know about Restating Orientalism is that it is not really about Said's celebrated work. As I repeatedly stress in the book, I dwell mainly in the first chapter on his work because even after 40 years of its publication, it continues to represent the mainstream outlook on the problems it dealt with. In other words, I deal with Said because his work remains standard, but neither the work nor the author stands in any way as my terminus ad quem. The second point I wish to make is that the discourse on Orientalism is analogous to the discourse on the Holocaust and other genocides, with the crucial difference that this genocide discourse has been developed in promising directions and been given some depth and critical dimensions. Anyone familiar with the writings of critical theory circles with Hannah Arendt and several others will know that the Holocaust and all phenomena of the same species are not exceptions to the modern condition, but rather structurally integral to it, embedded in it, and the consequence of it. To study one such genocide is to study a building block in the house of modernity. One of the goals of Restating Orientalism is to embark on a similar exercise with the explicit purpose of showing that Orientalism is not just a field of specialization within academia that has been inflicted with certain epistemological problems. Nor do I think that uncovering traces of Orientalism or racist discourse in European literature does anything to enlighten us about the structures of thought that made Orientalism possible. I am, of course, here referring to Said's other work, Culture and Imperialism. What I propose in this book is that we should look much deeper than what Said has articulated and what the entire post-colonial discourse that his work has spun has managed to accomplish. I locate the problems of Orientalism in the deepest structures of Enlightenment thought, and in fact in the epistemological and ethical makeup of modernity as a whole. I locate it, to be blunt, in its effective anti-human and anti-natural proclivities. Said, the liberal and secular humanist, could not, I argue, transcend his own epistemological boundaries in order to subject the very liberal project as an Orientalist one. In brief, and capitalizing on a theory of paradigms I elaborated in The Impossible State, the book before Restating Orientalism, I argue that all academic disciplines of the central domains, including the range of scientific fields, engineering, business schools, economics, law, psychiatry, philosophy, history, and a host of others, are, as fields of discourse and knowledge, deeply and structurally implicated in Orientalism. Being themselves Orientalist, they are complicit in colonialism over man and nature. So here already you can begin to sense that my definition of colonialism is wider than the conventional one. All of this, I should say, comes to about half of the book's argument. The other half, spreading over 3 long chapters, deals with problems and issues that were not on Said's mind, and likewise continue to be largely absent from the discourse that his work generated. One such issue is that of sovereignty, which I often tie to conceptions of agency as they have come to inhabit so much of post-colonial discourse. I argue that because of the rise in the 17th and 18th centuries of a new conception of the human, we have consequently come to inhabit a being in the world that is dominated by an unprecedented concept of sovereignty. That is sovereignty over everything, an unqualified sovereignty over everything. While many of us may not dispute this phenomenon, I don't think that we have sufficiently teased out its implications. Foucault, for instance, understands the problem with a penetrating insight, but he never really cared about its destructive colonialist effects on man, on humans, all humans, and on nature. The sovereignty of the secular age, I argue, has not only been implicated in genocide in its widest definition, and has not been responsible only for the wiping out of all so-called traditional cultures, but also for colonizing the future. By implication, sovereignty in restating Orientalism emerges not only as the real God of gods, but as a bundle of criminal and psychotic world of behavior. To make my case, I take a fairly close look at the corporation, especially the multinational variety, as well as the Schmittian Agamben state of exception, to show that the distance between modern polity and criminality and destruction is not a big one at all. That's one important theme in the book. But there is yet another. I argue that Said was confused about the theory of the author, misunderstanding Foucault, who himself, I think, did not tease out the implications of the very idea he dug into. The book then can be said to begin an inquiry into a typology of the author that identifies a new subset of authors, namely the dissenting and subversive authors. These are my categories. This classification also ties to Kant's and Foucault's concepts of critique, which was not immediately relevant to me in the book, but one that will hopefully follow soon. The point is that the author as critic must be distinguished, because it is precisely here that the meaning of critique finds its most fertile grounds. And so I capitalize on the notion of critique in order to sort out the kind of authors who meet and do not meet the qualification of so-called bad Orientalist and good Orientalist. To do so, I bring in the French Orientalist René Guénon, who emerges as a subversive author, as compared to Said himself, who is merely a descending author, and who is totally absent, by the way, from Said's Orientalism. Said doesn't even mention his name once. I say merely about Said being merely a dissenting author, because Said and the entire discourse his work has generated in Western academia have not met the conditions of critique I mean here. But my use of Guénon has more to it than meets the eye. I attempt to show that one can be an Orientalist and still be a subversive critic, which is to say that even if I were to call for the abolishment of many academic fields of the central domain, some of which I named before, I would not call for the deletion of departments of Orientalism. You might be very happy to know. Whether they study China, India, Africa, or Islam, among others. And the reason for this is precisely that it is through Orientalism, among some secondary others, that a subversive critique can be conducted, as I show to have mostly done. Finally, in the last part of the book, and after having dwelled at length on the rise in modernity of the problem of knowledge and power, I deploy a critique of the modern subject, especially the liberal one, and propose, while engaging the present disciplines of Orientalism and history, that to exit our current modes of knowledge, the subject must be reconstituted. But I must say that the story of this reconstitution is not complete, at least not for the moment. I take up this project of reconstitution, the sequel, if you wish, the sequel to Restating Orientalism, in the last part of another book that should appear next year, likely under the title Reforming Modernity. There I dwell again on the concepts of sovereignty, materialism, gratitude, and humility to make my argument for a new concept of the human, So one thing I'm going to ask you to keep in mind, that anything I'm going to say after this point is in fact directly tied to Orientalism. So I'm not giving you now another lecture which does not tie to the book itself. It is in fact integral to this understanding, or integral to my critique. Building on the Moroccan moral philosopher Abdul Rahman Taha's theorization of the subject, I argue that we can indeed speak of particular qualities that characterize the new concept of the human. The characteristics that are necessary, which are also the minimal essentials that make such a new human, will require her to be who she will need to be. As an antidote to the modern malaise, each of these characteristics are deemed essential because each performs, along with others, a particular task, the totality of which make up the condition of a sufficient palliative. Note also the medical terms here. If essences are involved in this narrative, it is because the malaise dictates and requires them as a matter of necessity. Change the malaise and the essences will in turn change. Since the diagnostic, that is critique, undeniably operates within a specific and fairly well-determined etiology, we can then comfortably speak of a set of necessary characteristics. Now, taking for granted that every subject must be located within and formed by one type of technology of the self or another, one type of habitus or another, invoking Bourdieu and others, a new concept of the human will be said, in light of modernity's specific crisis, to enjoy a number of essential characteristics, all of which are interrelated and constitute a single interconnected whole. But please note that what I am about to say goes right to the heart of what may be cast as how not to be an Orientalist, or how not to be a bad Orientalist, at least in the sense that has been inhabiting our academic terrains so far. In other words, to speak of the subject is to speak of the crisis of modern epistemology, including every academic disciplines, and of course including Orientalism. Now, a point of entry to this interconnected whole I'm speaking of is the characteristic of anti-materialism, generally defined as a critical and systematic transgression against divination of the material world, where matter, including the human as materially conceived, has been endowed with the highest values. Materialism is therefore not just a physically disposed attitude to the world, but also, and in fact, a metaphysical conception of material reality as one of brute, inert, and stupid matter, to cite Robert Boyle's famous descriptors. These are his characterizations, not mine. This metaphysics also rests on a potent conception of instrumentalism that systematically makes a habit of confusing ends with means, converting the former into the latter and rendering the modern telos an unattainable desideratum. The anti-materialists, by contrast, recognize higher principles as ever binding, precisely because these principles are not subject to the discretion of the whim of materialism. This is not to say that material existence should not be abolished from the world, for the world is, after all, made of matter. But the world is obviously not just matter, and nor is it just the total sum of all of its parts. Whether at the spiritual metaphysical level or material physical plane, sentient and insentient life lives in and with matter. The anti-materialist, therefore, recognizes that in this complex existence, materialism is no more than a means to an end. And the two are neither twain, nor are they to be confused. Matter is always subservient, yet still integral to a higher order of existence that is made of first-order ethical principles. The new concept of the human must therefore presuppose a subjectivity that is characterized by a categorical absence and total negation in its very constitution of sovereignty, perhaps the most important theme in both restating Orientalism and reforming modernity. Yet this is not to suggest that sovereignty is substantively separable from materialism, for both go hand in hand. In fact, they are concomitants, since modern materialism presupposes and lives on sovereignty, which is to say that materialism is made ontologically possible by an unbounded form of sovereign epistemology. This is to say that the unbounded materialism of modernity and its subject must be seen as subordinate to sovereignty, for it was this latter, sovereignty, that gave rise to what has been called by many commentators, philosophers, thinkers, an innate love of mastery and control. If all this is anywhere near acceptable, then it is not sufficient for a new concept of the human to entertain or settle for the resisting subject, the subversive agent who refuses, quote unquote, who we are, what we are, as Foucault put it. To become performative, refusal must embody itself in a normative substrate, a substructure of thought, action, and feeling that systematically and systemically embed resistance and refusal in a habituated psychoepistemology of humility and modesty, all of which run against the core of Foucault's concept of resistance. Humility includes the concept and habituated feeling of gratitude, without which no modesty before or respect of anything is ever possible. Nor is there gratitude without humility, or humility without modesty. If the Foucauldian refusal and resistance are negative approaches, and they certainly are, then humility, modesty, and gratitude are the positive, non-defensive, and self-confident modi vivendi of being in this world. A new concept of the human thus generates a subject who does not recognize sovereignty and who cannot conceive of herself as being sovereign. Here, the Kantian trio of free rational will, by which I mean the specifically Kantian architecture of freedom, rationality, and willing, has no place in the architecture of the new subject, who perceives herself as devoid of the impulse to mastery and the quest for power. Yet to say, as I have done, that the new subject conceives herself to be devoid of this impulse is to overstate the point and misrepresent it. The new human would be intrinsically incapable of this mode of cognition. For to be able to conceptualize the meaning of sovereignty, mastery, or domination is to already be engaged with them in one way or another. To think them and to know them is to entertain their possibilities and potentialities. For it is true, I shall insist, that cognition is not only consciousness of the possible, but also an inroad to the performative. It is my argument then that resistance and refusal, a characteristic Foucauldian duo that follow on the heel of critique, are insufficient for producing the new concept of the human I'm trying to articulate here. What is needed instead is a new habitus, and more precisely, a new form of embodiment and ethical cultivation that permit no place either for the love of mastery and domination or for the very cognition of any forms of sovereignty. A new concept of the human thus demands a new forms of acculturation, education, and upbringing. The forms in this new configuration take it for granted that the subject is formed by humility, modesty, and gratitude, all of which are not mere nouns and derivative descriptors, but effectively performative as technologies of the self. They are not, in yet other words, just qualities that we may preach or admire, but they rather stand as constitutive of a world of values in which the subject is born and nurtured, systematically, systemically, and constitutionally. Humility is never timidity or meekness, nor is it submission or servility. It is, like modesty, a world in which pride and vanity have no central room for maneuver. If pride and vanity are human qualities, which they undoubtedly are, then they are to be suppressed and kept at bay, just as we in the modern condition abhor dishonesty, cunning, and the like. If modesty is unpretentiousness, moderation, and simplicity, then gratitude is appreciation, thankfulness, and a deep feeling of indebtedness. And all of these interconnected qualities make for a new habitus, a performative technology, and an uncompromised way of living in the world, not above it. They are in the world, in other words, not the stuff of theory and words, but rather of praxis. And I mean praxis, not practice. This is a systematic way of doing things that practice does not convey. Nor is living in the world not above it, just a virtuous quality that makes for a merely desirable way of experiencing the world. Living in the world, our fourth characteristic, is nothing short of a psychoepistemology dictating how one qualitatively lives and the full meaning of living in the world. A new concept of the human recognizes the world as a unity, where all things, sentient and insentient, stand in an interconnected whole. This is an inner, formative conception of reality, a view from within, an outlook integral to and internally embedded in a conception of the world as one formed by interconnections and continuity. To say that the world is continuous is to conceive of a fabric of being that makes everything one does, every omission and commission, relevant and thus effectual to everything else. It is also to say that because this living in the world is a psychoepistemology, continuousness and continuity are substantively made of an ethical fiber, endowed with an epistemology and ontology of responsibility and accountability. Whatever one does or says, or one does not do or say, has an effect on something ad seriatim around it, both conceptually and existentially. And if ethics is the way in which we speak of a genuine concept of responsibility, then everything that is said, done, or altogether omitted is inevitably engulfed and judged by this ethic. Responsibility then cannot be grounded in a rhetoric whose foundations are laid by anthropocentrism or secular humanism, for these have proven incapable of genuine solutions to many of the problems generated precisely because of them. This is partly the business of chapter 5, the last chapter in the book. The idea here is that the new human sees itself as standing in a series of equally created beings, all deserving of respect precisely due to the indomitable fact of equal createdness. Yet this equality is distinguishable, or must be distinguishable. The fact that the mare and its foal are equal members of the equidae never entails assigning them the same functions or responsibilities. Just as the mare is under the natural instinctive duty of caring and attending to its foal, the human is under the primordial obligation of universal stewardship. This is the natural lot and burden of humanity, just because it has been assigned in the nature of things to bear the unique weight of ethics. This is why Abdurrahman Taha, the Moroccan philosopher I mentioned, who's the subject of the second book, refuses the identification of the quiddity of humanity as a merely rational species, as, for example, Aristotle and the long tradition has done. For modern rationality, as a denuded and narrow form of reason, has proven capable of turning things into their opposites. If it is, after all, modern rationality that has justified and performed genocides, cultural and communal destruction, environmental destruction, and innumerable forms of atrocities and calamities. The concept of continuity and continuousness in the world thus demands bearing the burden of ethical responsibility of stewardship. But unlike Hans Jonas and his likes, who seem incapable of comprehending the depth of the status of equal createdness, we must not allow for this massively interconnected link to be missed. Humility and gratitude are not just states of consciousness. They are so crucial precisely because the human species is both burdened and privileged by the duty of trusteeship and stewardship, both of which translate into a care of the world. To be a steward is to live in a world that is psychoepistemically saturated with humility and gratitude. It is to live in a world that does not, much less recognize, does not know, much less recognize mastery and love of domination, and in one word, sovereignty. This absence is in fact a productive presence, for there is no empty space or gap left by the unknowability of mastery. The space is rather an already full mental landscape that understands the necessity and implications of what it means to be a created thing. The very appreciation of the meaning of createdness, of man's contingency, ephemerality, fragility, death, and ultimate insignificance is precisely the necessary thick link that Jonas and others like him have overlooked. But as creatures of the secularized liberal habit, they have also missed the significance of praxis and psychoepistemology in ethical habituation, a lack that is also strikingly absent from Foucault, as well as Judith Butler and others. In fact, Foucault insists on it being absent. Jonas's concept of fear, that we will become good stewards of the earth out of fear that we will annihilate ourselves, for this concept of fear he is most well known. Jonas's concept of fear can never on its own accomplish much. It is for the most part unproductive. When the subject engages a praxis of ethical formation, she effectively engages a set of signifiers that bring together the communal and divine good as a unified world of reference. It is to understand the full meaning of the summum bonum, which is to say that the good is not a constrained notion of human welfare, but one that brings the individual, the community, and cosmology into one interconnected whole. I think it should be clear by now that the link between Orientalism and the crisis of modern knowledge are not just about how we represent others, and not about how we shouldn't be racist, how we shouldn't be arrogant or domineering. This is a relatively superficial stuff. This is what occupied Said. When we deal with Orientalism, we would be terribly amiss if we do not approach it as the distillation of the foundational crisis of modern knowledge, crises that call upon us to reassess the modern subject as the ultimate locus and seat of this knowledge. To study Orientalism is to study these crises as they inhabit virtually the entire range of academia. To study Orientalism, therefore, must ultimately drive us to find alternatives to who we are. It is in these alternatives that rest on praxis that we can resist. It is with these alternatives that a new system will emerge. Liberation does not come from a state or some political system. Liberation comes from the inside. Thank you.